All right, so we left off with this radical shift in worldview, in belief system, in the way we view the miracle of our human birth, of our human incarnation, and what that means for us in terms of spiritual practice. And so in a program that was developed between one of my Buddhist teachers, B. Alan Wallace, and some modern psychologists like Paul Ekman, and this was all done in collaboration with the Dalai Lama, they came up with four balances or four intelligences that we cultivate, and they're important to cultivate to have a balanced mind and a balanced spiritual practice. And the first of these is cognitive intelligence. And this is what we just dealt with. This is the area of our life that has to do with our aspirations, our volition, what we're going for, our vision for our life. And of course, that is deeply rooted in, as we spoke before, in our belief system. And so this is something that we really have to cultivate. We have to take the time to shift this area of cognitive intelligence from something that is just inherited, something that is just conditioned, something that is unconscious, to something that is investigated, is looked into, and then becomes a conscious framework, a conscious blueprint, so that we have conscious beliefs that are based in something that we've actually looked into and not just something that we were told. And then from that, we then can have this intelligence arising of intelligent aspirations, intelligent visions for a life. Visions, aspirations, goals that are aligned with the nature of reality and that are aligned with the true causes of authentic happiness and the true causes of authentic suffering. So we know what we have to navigate. And so this is this cognitive intelligence, which is often overlooked or taken for granted. And so it's such an important part of spiritual practice and just general mental well-being to really investigate this. And so on that note, we discussed these four thoughts, these four transformations of the mind, these four revolutions of the mind: the precious human birth, the meditation on impermanence and death, the consideration of cause and effect, of karma, the imprints and how they ripen, and then finally of the nature of suffering in this conditioned existence. And so each of these thoughts, each of these contemplations can really serve as a basis for a meditation practice. And so, these don't really need to be guided. But what we can do is we can work through each of these ideas on our own and really contemplate them, look into them, and meditate on their significance. So really meditate, take some time out to consider that you are born, that you are human, that you are alive, that you have awareness, that you have consciousness, and what are the implications of this. And this is what is described as a analytical or not analytical, but discursive meditation. So it's a thinking process. It's a contemplative thinking process. It's not simply focusing on an object and holding there. It's a meditation more in line with the Western understanding of what meditation means, meaning more of contemplation. And so you step into a quiet place, or you go for a walk, or you go somewhere in nature and sit somewhere and you contemplate these things. And you can use texts from the tradition or investigation you're doing on your own on things like near-death experience or reports like these children who've reported previous lives, things like this. You do your own investigation. You really look into this and you consider the implications of this and what you want to choose to take as your working hypothesis as you set out on the path. And similarly with impermanence and death, this is something to take into your heart and to contemplate really every day. What if this were my last day? What if today, what I'm doing today, is it the most meaningful thing I could be doing in light of the fact that today could be the last day? And that's, I think, Steve Jobs actually did that every morning. He'd look in the mirror and say, if I were to die at the end of today, is this what I would want to be doing? And so it really has a way of supercharging the way we engage in meaningful activity in our life, rather than just killing time and just letting the days pass. So this is a deep meditation to consider, and you can just contemplate the impermanence of everything, contemplate the impermanence of people you've known, of people who've come and gone, and so on and so forth. And if you really want to get into it, there's also a meditation you can do meditate on being born as an animal. Meditate on being born as a human being with nowhere near the privileges that you have. Consider all of the possible births that you could have had all around the world. I've spent a fair amount of time in India and Nepal, and some of the circumstances in which people live, it's just unbelievable. Not to mention the way that some animals are treated there, and you just consider as you're seeing this intense suffering all around you, why not me? That could have easily been me. It probably has been me in the past. And so doing this contemplation of all of the ways you could have been born, and then realizing the great fortune you have to have been born in your circumstances, with the opportunities, the leisure, and the endowments that you have in this life. All of your faculties working, the whole possibility to practice, and then teachings in front of you to practice. So just keep returning to this as a meditation, not as something that we hear once and then we say, oh yeah, impermanence, death, got it. This is something that we continue to return to. And as I said before, especially with impermanence and death, if we really meditate on this, other insights will be revealed, like that which is beyond impermanence and death, or the way that impermanence itself indicates interdependent origination, which then indicates emptiness of all phenomena. We'll get into that later, but it's very loaded as we consider impermanence. And then also meditating on the fact of karma, the fact of all seeds ripening, and understanding the need to start to plant good seeds and to purify past negative seeds that we have planted. And this is something that we'll get into in more depth later. But I just want to say, as we begin to consider karma, we may begin to really deeply consider some of the actions we've taken in our life. And the desire may arise within us to purify or confess, or just generally release things that we've been holding on to, guilt or anything. And as we go deeper and become more subtle in our practice, we'll really just want to purify everything. And it will even though if we can't remember previous lifetimes, we'll have the desire to just imagine that there's any number of wrong things we could have done and just purify them all, because we begin to almost crave, almost desire a more purified mind, a more purified being. And so this act of confession, this act of releasing any guilt, any negativity that's held in our mind is actually a really pleasurable and meaningful practice. And so we'll go into this deeper later, but just to begin with, you can do this simply by generating an image of your version of the divine, or simply a white light, or simply an orb at your heart, or simply a presence, knowing that this divine presence is all around you, knowing that it's non-judgmental, knowing that it's here to hold you, to care for you, and that it always has open arms for you. And this makes me think of the story of the prodigal son in the Bible, and this idea that God or the Buddha mind or whatever we want to, the divine, whatever we want to call it, it has always been there with open arms for us. But it is us as individuals in delusion who have turned away. And we might feel, I've done some negative things, so I feel a little guilty, or I feel a little embarrassed. But as soon as we turn back to the light, and begin to confess and begin to release all of these patterns that have been going on in our mind to keep us away from the divine. As soon as we begin to do that, the divine is there with open arms. And just like the father in the story of the prodigal son welcomes the wayward son home with open arms and with total love and with no sense of where have you been, or you've been a really bad boy or anything like that. It's just this, I've always been here for you, and I'm so happy that you've returned. And so with that understanding, we can generate this feeling of the higher power, of the divine, of whatever it might be for you, and then just comb through your mind, comb through your memories, and see if there's anything that you want to just get off your chest, anything you want to get right with, anything that you want to just release and let go of. Because as we venture deeper into meditation, these things are going to come up. We're not going to be able to go deeper into meditation practice if we are still holding on to these things. And so it behooves us at the very outset to, as Ram Dass said in his famous book, Be Here Now, is to get right, to get clean, to get right with ourselves, to get right with the people around us, to get right with the world, and to get right with the divine. And so, this can take the form of our own inner purifications as we confess in our own heart and as we release in our own heart. But it can also take the form of reaching out to somebody who you have a grudge with, or who you have yet to forgive, or who you've done some wrong to, or something like that, and begin to mend these wounds and put out these fires. And maybe you have no fires. Maybe everything is aligned for you right now, and that's wonderful. But we can at least investigate this and see: are there any fires I could put out? Are there any bridges that I could mend? And so as we do this, we notice that we begin to have more inner peace and more spaciousness and receptivity to the process of meditation. And this is really the reason for ethics or morality or righteousness or benevolence on the spiritual path. I mean, one, we're trying not to harm anyone, but on a deeper level, in terms of our own mind, when we engage in negative actions, it creates a negative imprint in our mind, and it creates guilt, and it creates constriction, and it keeps us from just this peaceful release into the arms of the divine. And so it really makes sense for us to engage in an ethical way of life and to examine our life in terms of its ethical conduct, such that we can be a more suitable vessel for the spiritual path and the process of meditation, which, like I said, will bring these things up. You can't hide in meditation. It will bring all of these things up, and we will have to confront them sooner or later. So again, bringing to mind the divine, bringing to mind this benevolent, forgiving presence, and just releasing out loud, declaring anything, confessing anything that you want to release, and knowing that in that process of releasing it, a purification is taking place. And that now that karmic seed is being, remember I said, karmic seeds ripen unless something else happens to it. And so it still may ripen in some way, but by purifying it through this confessional act, we are lessening its impact in the future. And we are purifying our mind, and we are bringing ourselves to peace through that process. And so as we do this, there's a few components to it. One is what's called the support, and these are called the four powers in Buddhism, but really applies to all spiritual traditions. And the first element is the support. So this is the divine. So if you are Buddhist, it could be an image of a Buddha. If you are a Christian, it could be an image of Jesus. Or if you're a Muslim, they don't do images of Allah, but the presence of Allah or the presence of God, and so on and so forth. The same in Judaism. And that is your support for making the confession. So you're making the confession to someone, something. But of course, in this case, it's not a human being. It's not anyone who's going to have any judgment. It's simply the divine. And then the second is the regret for having done it. And again, not in a petty way of kind of like, oh, I'm such a bad person, but just the heartfelt sense of, I see why that was harmful for my mind and maybe for other people. And I don't want to perpetuate that anymore in my life. And so I really do feel remorse for having engaged in those activities, and I just want to release it now and move on. You know, that type of regret. And then the next being the resolve to never do it again, you know, as much as we can, you know, to really say, from here on out, I'm not going to think that way. From here on out, I'm not going to act that way. From here on out, I'm going to purify my mind. I'm going to live with an ethical code that allows me to maintain a peace of mind, and that doesn't have me looking over my shoulder, doesn't have me trying to cover my tracks or anything like that. And then finally is the actual antidote, the actual action that we take, the remedy to it, and that is the confession. And then from that, you can then visualize the white light of the divine purifying your whole being, and like black smoke just clearing out, and gunk and anything, pus and blood and yuckiness, any of these negativities, any of these old imprints can then just be just totally purified out of the body as this white light enters the body and allows for total purification. And so that's the remedy. So as we meditate on karma, this desire to do this may come up. And so on the one hand, we're purifying the past, and on the other hand, we're planting good seeds for the future. And also to take this whole purification process into our daily life, this is something that we can do at the end of every day, right? So at the beginning of every day, we make the resolve to live in the best way possible, to plant the best seeds, to engage in virtuous practice, to evolve spiritually, to be kind to others, to live with wisdom and love and compassion. And then we do our best. You know, we do our best throughout the day to keep this mindfulness, to keep this awareness. And then at the end of the day, we check in on how we did, you know, in a very non-judgmental way, but we write down maybe 3 good things that we did, 3 good things that happened, and then 3 things that weren't so great and that we'd like to purify. And then we can engage in this process of confession and purification, and we can really feel that we've been cleansed from that, and we have been revitalized to then go on with the next day and try to do even better. And as we go through this process day by day, this purification will deepen and deepen. And this in and of itself, I mean, this is really, you know, we talk about meditation like it's the only part of the spiritual path, but I mean, this is integral to any success that you'll ever have in terms of meditation. So I really encourage us to take this to heart and to return to this again and again. And again, I just want to drive home this point that this isn't always necessarily like very, like, oh, I, you know, beat somebody up, or I, you know, stole something outright. It may be that, and those are great things to purify. But as we go further and further, it can become just more and more subtle, you know? Like, I just had some really negative thoughts about so-and-so today, or, you know, I really had some violent impulses, or, you know, I kind of sent that person a dirty look, you know? And again, no one was hurt, nothing happened, but you'll begin to know in your mind that that's creating a disturbance in your mind, and eventually you'll want to just purify that. You'll just want to be released from that and just come into more and more of a flow of just constant benevolence, love, compassion, and spacious wisdom of awareness. And so any little, you know, all of these things, all these negative things, what are they? They're like constrictions, right? They're like graspings. They're you know? And so as we become more and more subtle, the less that, or the more we will want to be free of any type of constriction like that. And so, I mean, in my own case, anytime I feel anything like that coming up, I try to do a little purification and just release it. Bring to mind loving kindness, bring to mind the divine, whatever it might be, whatever works for you, but seeing that this is an ongoing purificatory process, okay? And then the final, so that was our contemplation of karma, and this is something we should always come back to. And then again with the 4th thought, which is the thought of suffering. And again, we talked about the 3 types of suffering. the blatant suffering of, of living, old age, sickness, and death, just all of the, crazy things that can happen to us as an embodied human being. And then the suffering of change, which is just that, uncomfortability of things always changing. And then 3, the suffering, the subtle suffering, the pervasive suffering, the suffering that is inherent to existing in a deluded state where we are grasping at the reality of self and other, and we are creating a duality and living in duality. And so we can begin to contemplate this experience of living in terms of these experiences of suffering, and we can come to see that we don't feel like it's such an injustice anymore when these sufferings come up. Like, I hear people, sometimes people say things like, I can't believe, this is all going on. I can't believe this is happening again. And from a Buddhist perspective, it's like, well, that's the nature of this reality. That is the nature of this existence. And so it shouldn't be a surprise when these things arise and we have to deal with them. And if we're constantly meditating on this and recognizing that that this is the nature of this existence, then we're not taken by surprise and we're able to cope with it in a better way. And not only that, but this contemplation of suffering also, as I said before, leads to the deep inspiration to take up the path. And so again, we talked about this view, meditation, and conduct. And this is where all of these meditations are taking us. It's not just to contemplate, oh yeah, death and impermanence, what a bummer, and oh yeah, suffering, what a bummer. But it's to spur us on to realize that there's another way. So because again, the Buddha taught the first noble truth is that there is suffering. The second noble truth is the cause of suffering, which is this grasping and this clinging to self, this clinging to that which is not I and mine as I and mine. And then third, he said that there is an antidote, that there's a way out of this suffering. That's very important. And then fourth, that there's a path to do that. So it's not just, oh, what a bummer, but what a bummer to live this way. And wow, now there's a path that I can take up that will bring me out of this suffering and bring me towards liberation. And so this is all working to create in ourselves this spirit of emergence that we talked about before, to take up a new view, meditation, and way of life. Okay, so we talked about the view before, the view of materialism, the meditation of hedonism, pleasure, stimulus, all of that, the next movie, the next drug, the next drink, the next, whatever, the next sex, whatever it might be. And then the way of life of accumulating more and more goods and more money and more experiences and more. Culture of more. So switching that and saying, okay, there's another view, meditation and conduct. The view of Buddha nature, the view of reality being a pure expanse that is naturally perfect and that we can come to see through practice, through our meditation, is actually totally pure and perfect and without suffering. And so then we can engage in all of these different types of meditation that are cultivating our heart and our mind, cultivating this eudaimonia, this lasting happiness, and then engage in a way of life that is simplified, that is virtuous, that is everything that is aligning us with our truest nature, and that is aligning us with eudaimonia and this authentic happiness, and that is aligning us with the path to liberation. So with that said, come back to these meditations again and again, and really think of them as meditations to do. You can sit down for a session and just focus on one of these topics. And a great book on this is Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche's book called Turning Confusion into Clarity. He's a great Tibetan Lama, highly realized and wonderful teacher. And he goes into more depth into all of these topics. So again, let's remember these 4 thoughts always, and let's remember that their purpose is not to bring us down, but to actually spur us on to the next things that we're going to get to in these teachings, which is actually the beginnings of the path and the practice and more meditation. So we'll go into that now.